The question we hope to answer today is, did your ancestors go through Ellis Island? We will be following several Crystal Lake citizens on their immigration experience to discover some of the history of Ellis Island and the United States early immigration process. There are two important questions to ask to learn if your immigrant ancestors came through Ellis Island. First is, where did they arrive? And second, when did they arrive? The first question is fairly simple. When I was doing research on the Swedish immigrants who settled in the Crystal Lake area and became a part of Swedenberg, one of the things I wanted to find out was whether or not they had come through Ellis Island. I found the arrival ports of 498 Swedenberg Swedes and was surprised to find how many different ports were used by Swedish immigrants. This is a map which shows those 8 ports. Now we'll add the number of Swedenberg citizens who arrived at each port. So 48 Swedes who would settle in Crystal Lake arrived in Boston. I was surprised to find 25 Crystal Lake Swedes arrived in Quebec. Now, none of these immigrants would have seen the Statue of Liberty. None of these immigrants would have stepped foot on Ellis Island. In spite of all these different ports, that still leaves 405, or 81% of the Swedenberg immigrants who arrived in New York. New York was the main port of entry, and that is where Ellis Island is. So the answer to the first question, if your ancestors were to go through Ellis Island, they had to arrive in New York. The 405 Crystal Lake Swedes who arrived in New York may have been processed at Ellis Island because they arrived in the correct place. However, I did say may have been processed there. The other question we need to ask is, when did they arrive in New York? And here things get a bit more complicated. This is an illustration of Manhattan in 1850. You can see Governor's Island at the bottom right. Ellis Island and Bedloe's Island, where the Statue of Liberty would eventually stand, are just off the map to the south. What happened if you arrived in New York before 1855? Let's look at an early Crystal Lake citizen to illustrate what happened. Reverend Peter Arvedson was the earliest Swedenberg Swede to arrive in America. He was a clerk in a shop in Norrköping, Sweden. He left from Göteborg on his 19th birthday in 1841 and arrived in New York aboard the SS Flavius almost 2 months later. Peter would eventually farm in Algonquin Township on the corner of what is today Route 31 and Virginia Road. I believe there are still traces of that farm where Rayscape Landscaping is now located. The farmer Peter brought his produce to the Crystal Lake Pickling and Preserves Works, which is where the Municipal Center is located today on the corner of Walkup in Woodstock. He also became an ordained minister and was the first to serve the Swedish population in Nunda in Crystal Lake, taking his horse and buggy on the dirt road that led from his farm to town. Peter Arvedson also served as minister to the forerunner of St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Crystal Lake, as well as serving St. John's in Algonquin and other startup congregation in Blevins Mills, which is today Spring Grove, McHenry, Richmond, Harvard, Woodstock, Marengo, Dundee, I'm not done, just catching my breath, Elgin, Barrington, Chicago, and Wilmot, Wisconsin. I kid you not. For our purposes today, you can read the last line, immigration station. If you arrived in New York before 1855, as Peter Arvedson did, there was no immigration process. Now, this probably had its benefits and its drawbacks. There was no one to keep you from being here, but there was also no one to assist you or to protect you from swindlers. Before 1855, you were on your own, and that was true for 10 Swedenberg Swedes. So what happened in 1855? Let's go back to the illustration of New York from 1850. I would like to point out a curious round building off the southern coast of Manhattan, joined to it by only a narrow bridge. This southwest battery was built between 1808 and 1811 to protect New York from the British in the War of 1812, even though its 28 cannons were never fired during that war. In 1815, the fort was renamed Castle Clinton to honor New York City Mayor DeWitt Clinton. In 1823, the military ceded the fort to New York City, which changed its name to Castle Garden, and it became an entertainment venue. If you were at Castle Garden on September 11th, 1850, you would have been treated to the concert of the century. A century before the Beatles played at Shea Stadium, well over 100 years before Beatlemania, this was Lynn-mania, as the media at the time called it. The famous promoter, P.T. Barnum, convinced the world-renowned opera singer, Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, to give a series of concerts in America. Here, at Castle Garden, on September 11th, 1850, was her first concert. Less than 5 years later, Castle Garden would open as the first immigration station in the United States. It was operated by the state of New York and looked like this in 1861. By 1873, landfill had eliminated the need for a bridge and provided a park known as Battery Park. Today, it is referred to as the Battery. Another Crystal Lake settler, Benno Rau, was 17 years old when he left his home in Wolfenbüttel, Braunschweig, where he was a watchmaker, and he boarded the SS Bohemia in Hamburg on August 26, 1883. He arrived in New York and was processed for immigration at that round building on the south end of Manhattan, Castle Garden. It had been in operation for almost 30 years by the time Benno arrived. In Crystal Lake, Benno was the manager and second violin for Nunda's popular Phoenix Orchestra, featured in the 2022 Crystal Lake Historical Society calendar. He owned and operated a hardware store on Williams Street from 1908 until his death in 1961. There he is on the left in his hardware store around 1913, which was on the west side of Williams Street at the time. The Rau Center of the Arts is named for his family. Now we have Christian Snyder, who was 20 years old when he left his hometown of Bergen, Norway, aboard the SS Adriatic as a steerage passenger. He arrived in New York, where he was also processed at Castle Garden. He became head of the modeling department at America Terracotta and Ceramic. Christian did terracotta modeling for 6 banks designed by the famous architect Louis Sullivan. Here, Christian poses in 1907 at American Terracotta with the modeling work for the first of those banks. The result looks like this on the bank today, which is the National Farmers Bank of Owatonna, Minnesota. $7.7 million immigrants came through Castle Garden. 122 of Crystal Lake Swedes came through Castle Garden, so not a small number. Now, one thing Benno Rao and Christian Snyder did not see when they arrived in New York was the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty, a gift from France when we ended slavery, became an iconic symbol of American immigration. When Benno and Christian arrived, foundation work for the Statue of Liberty had already begun on Bedloe Island, which was renamed Liberty Island in 1956. But if you arrived here before October 1886's unveiling, like Benno and Christian, it would not have been part of your experience. 5 years after Christian Snyder arrived, Castle Garden was closed. The federal government was finally going to become involved and build its own immigration station on Ellis Island in New York Harbor. While it was being built, the barge office in Battery Park was used to process third-class passengers, which is what most immigrants were. Here's another view of the barge office. Now, Fred Kling was one of those third-class passengers. He was 11 years old in 1891 when he came to America with his parents and siblings. They did get to see the Statue of Liberty. The Kling family were following Fred's older brother Martin, who had already settled in Crystal Lake. Fred became first violin in the Phoenix Orchestra, but became more well known for all the buildings he helped build in Crystal Lake. Here are a few examples of his work. In 1905 to 1907, he and his brother Martin did the stonework on the homes Stonehurst and Elmhurst at the corner of Crystal Lake Avenue and Elmhurst Street. In 1912 and 1913, with his partner Theo Randau, Fred built this brick block of buildings on Williams Street, which contained A.J. Severn's drugstore and the Crystal Theater. The buildings look like this today. The flag store in the middle was also the last and longest residence of Benno Rao's hardware store. In 1916, Mr. Kling built a Sears house, a honeymoon home for his bride-to-be, Anna Karlstedt, at 355 West Crystal Lake Avenue, where the couple was married. And in 1931, he completed the fine brickwork for the Public Service Building at 111 South Main Street, which would soon become scatter wallpaper. Today, it is the home of G&M Manufacturing. Fred and his family were processed at the barge office. A total of 25 Swedenberg Swedes were processed at the barge office in the 2+ years before Ellis Island's immigration station was up and running. The federal government had repurposed a Navy munitions depot located on Ellis Island. Ellis Island looked like the drawing on the right in 1890. And after the island was enlarged for the immigration station, it looked like the drawing on the left in 1897. This beautiful wooden structure, the first federal immigration station in the United States, was completed, and immigrants began being processed here on January 1st, 1892. The waters surrounding Ellis Island, though, were too shallow for the transatlantic ships to navigate. So many of the shipping companies had their docks on Manhattan or in Hoboken, New Jersey. And from there, immigrants were ferried to Ellis Island for immigration processing. Another map might be helpful. In the smaller map there, you can see Manhattan and the arrow pointing to Ellis Island. Now, many of the important ports were located in the red box at Hoboken in New Jersey, and that has been enlarged here. For example, Ben O'Rowe would have landed here at the Hamburg America port in 1883 before being ferried to Castle Garden. A majority of the Swedenberg Swedes who came to New York first set foot in America here at the Scandinavian American Line port in Hoboken, and then were ferried to Ellis Island. Edla Bergstrand should have first set foot here, but her adventure to America was more exciting than anticipated. She left from Copenhagen, Denmark, aboard the SS Eastland in January 1894. You might be tempted to say island, but Eastland is the Scandinavian word for the country of Iceland, which was then part of the Danish kingdom. The Eastland made 2 scheduled stops in Norway before hitting the high seas. On January 27th, the Eastland ran into a harrowing storm off Greenland, described in the ship log as a hurricane. One sailor was lost in the Atlantic. The ship managed to get back to Scotland, landing at Greenock for repairs, and all the passengers were transferred to the SS Bernesia. Edla was fine, but she lost all her luggage. He finally arrived in New York on February 23rd, late and luggageless, but not lost. When she came to port, it was on Manhattan, where Furnesia's Anchor Line port was. Edla then took a ferry to Ellis Island, where she was processed for immigration in that wooden structure. In America, Edla found work as a maid in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where she met the Swedish emigrant Hans Nelson. They married and moved to the Crystal Lake area, renting farms until 1909, when they purchased this farm on Ridgefield Road. Here is the family outside their farmhouse in 1913. The family farmed here until 1919, when Hans became ill. They moved to town and purchased a house at the end of Gates Street. the family poses in front of their house at 12 Gate Street in 1920. This house was lost with the latest expansion of Walk-Up Avenue. Edla was one of only 23 Swedenberg Swedes processed in this building on Ellis Island. Why so few? Well, there's a problem with beautiful wooden structures. They burn. And June 15th, 1897 was a bad day for Ellis Island and a bad day for genealogists. While thankfully no one was killed in the blaze, all Castle Garden records and some of the early Ellis Island records were destroyed. And so it was back to the barge office while Ellis Island was being rebuilt. You remember the barge office. Here's a later photo of it. The Swedish-born Emma Friberg came to America when she was 20 years old and was processed at the barge office in September 1900 because the new structure on Ellis Island would not be ready for another 2 months. After being processed at the barge office, Emma caught a train to Chicago, where her brother August lived. Here in Chicago, she met her future husband, the carpenter Ed Johnson. In October 1910, Ed bought 2 lots on Fairview Park Avenue in the heart of Swedenberg in Crystal Lake. He wrote this postcard telling Emma he had bought the lots. The next year, he built this house for his new bride at what is today 360 Fairview Park, where they would live the rest of their lives. They were very active in the Swedish Mission Church, which was only a short walk away. Ed became its 4th and by far longest running chairman. Though they had no children, Ed and Emma for years organized the Christmas Day program for the church with the Sunday school children. So 12 Swedenberg Swedes were processed at the barge office during this smaller time frame before Ellis Island was back in operation in December 1900. You were probably wondering when the star of the show was going to appear. Well, finally, here it is. Another future Crystal Lake merchant arrived in New York in 1906. Peter Metropolus, who was born in Manchuria, Tripoli, Greece, was 17 years old and working as a laborer when he decided to make a change. He left for America from Le Havre, France, aboard La Savoie, and arrived in New York on April 23rd. He was processed at the second Ellis Island building. When he came to Crystal Lake in 1912, Peter and his partner, Joseph Duros, opened the Crystal Lake ice cream parlor, first on the left side of this building on Woodstock Street, where the Judith Svalander School of Ballet is located today. The next year, they moved to the corner of William Street, where the Cafe Olympic is located today. That same year, however, Peter returned to his homeland to enlist and fight in the Balkan Wars. He returned to Crystal Lake in the ice cream parlor in 1914, only to leave again in 1918 to train at Camp Grant in Rockford become a US citizen, and serve in France and Germany in World War I. After the war, he returned to Crystal Lake to operate the ice cream parlor again. In 1920, Peter married, and the newlyweds first lived above the business. However, they soon bought this house on 4 lots at what is today 25 Gates Street. Except for when he was fighting in wars, he operated the corner ice cream parlor from 1913 until 1959, when Peter retired. Jessie Mackenzie, who was born in Scotland, lived in Inverness when she met and married American Navy electrician Louis Lenox, serving in Great Britain during World War I. After the war, when Louis settled in his work in the States, Jessie and their daughter Louise immigrated. They were processed at Ellis Island, the second building, before catching a train to Chicago. The Lenox family lived in Chicago for a while, then moved out to Crystal Lake, where Louis worked for Illinois Bell. They rented this house at 60 North Carolina Street on the corner of Caroline and Center Street before purchasing this home at 40 Woodstock Street in what was called E.C. Colby's subdivision. This house once stood next to Stearns Lumber, where the municipal building is today. Here's what Ellis Island's registry room, or Great Hall, as it was also called, looked like during a recent visit in 2017. Ellis Island, however, did not always look the same. When I did family research, I found when my grandfather, Niels Persson, came through Ellis Island in 1910, the registry room looked like this. But when my grandmother, Anna Fredrika Furr, arrived at Ellis Island less than 2 years later in 1912, it looked like this, and they had taken down all those bars. So between 1900 and its closing in 1954, Ellis Island II processed 180 Crystal Lake Swedes. However, one more thing needs to be explained before we end our story. The Immigration Act of 1924, signed by Calvin Coolidge, limited the number of immigrants who could enter the United States. Shortly thereafter, Ellis Island was used primarily as a detention center, and the immigrants, many who now had visas, were mainly processed aboard ship, never setting foot on Ellis Island. Now, one Crystal Lake citizen who arrived in New York after 1924 was the Swede Emma Anderson Stromstedt. She was married with 2 children, and the whole family left Sweden to come to the United States. However, late 1929 was not a great time to arrive on America's shores. The stock market had crashed on October 29th, and the authorities were worried about admitting individuals who did not have at least $25 on them, which was required by law, but not always strictly enforced. When Emma and her husband and their 2 school-aged children arrived, they were detained on Ellis Island. They were labeled LPC, likely public charge. The family was on Ellis Island long enough to have 4 meals. They may have been detained until a family member sent them money, but they were eventually admitted. Their original final destination was to be Emma's uncle in Plum City, Wisconsin. However, plans changed. Emma's sister, Julia Lindell, lived in Crystal Lake at 58 Nelson Avenue, what is today 61 Lincoln Parkway. And the Stromstedt family came here soon after being released from Ellis Island. When the 1930 census was taken a few months later, they were renting this house at 18 Nelson Avenue, just down the street from Emma's sister. The house once stood on property just north of the Swedish Mission Church. And in fact, that house became the parsonage of that church in 1955. The original church and parsonage no longer stand. The Salvation Army building on Lincoln Parkway and Crystal Lake Avenue is located there now. So back to Ellis Island to summarize. These are the dates when the various immigration stations in New York were used. Looking at the 405 Swedenberg Swedes who came through New York, we can see that only 203 of them actually went through Ellis Island. But you can go there today. Today, Ellis Island is a wonderful historic attraction, restored and opened in September 1990, telling the story of immigration to the United States for many of our ancestors. This is a modern view of the harbor. And we can also close in on the Battery on Manhattan and see that Castle Garden still partially stands today. It was renamed Castle Clinton National Monument in 1975. It is where you can get tickets on Manhattan for the ferry ride, the Statue of Liberty, and to Ellis Island today. Are there any questions?